Do you get along with your neighbors? In a world where even the closest family members can turn out to be liars, traitors, or murderers, it is often the people we have lived next to for years who unexpectedly become a source of safety, stability, and justice. They see us every day, hear our voices, and are capable of noticing the smallest details. Details that can lead to solving a crime when the police and prosecutors have given up. A missing anchor, stolen valuables, but most importantly, a neighbor's keen observation helped detectives uncover what happened to the suddenly vanished Jeanette Piro and Christopher "Chris" Benedetto. They say every cloud has a silver lining, and Christopher, or Chris Benedetto, experienced this firsthand. Since childhood, Chris had been passionate about fishing, and whenever possible, he would leave his hometown of New York for Florida to fish and relax on the beach. The rest of the time, he worked as a carpenter and ran a small business. While renovating his sister's house, Chris met an interior designer, Jeanette Piro. Sparks flew instantly between them. They were drawn to each other, and working on the house together allowed them to spend a lot of time in each other's company. In 1990, Chris and Jeanette married in their beloved state of Florida. Everything was going great until, 5 years later, Chris fell from scaffolding and broke his spine. The injury was severe, requiring multiple surgeries. To help support his back, doctors implanted 4 steel rods into his spine. He received a $2 million settlement from insurance companies and contractors, a sum that seemed substantial at the time. But Chris and Jeanette needed that money because he knew he would never be able to work again. He had to take strong painkillers and wear an orthopedic brace for back support. His doctor advised him to leave New York, warning that if he ever slipped on ice and fell, he could be permanently disabled. Since both Chris and Jeanette loved Florida, and the climate there was much milder, they decided to relocate. They bought a home on Singer Island, along with a fishing boat, and embraced their new lifestyle. Chris and Jeanette loved their life by the ocean. Their faces reflected their joy, and they quickly became part of the Singer Island community. They befriended their neighbors and spoke with them every single day. That was the case until the evening of Wednesday, November 11th, 1998, when the couple had planned to have dinner with their neighbors. However, they never showed up and didn't inform anyone. Something very unlike the usually polite, considerate, and courteous Jeanette and Chris. Thursday came and went, then Friday, but no one had seen them. By the weekend, newspapers had piled up at their doorstep, forming an increasingly noticeable stack. Their mailbox remained untouched. Their neighbors grew seriously concerned. The neighbors decided to check something. In their community, it was common practice for everyone to have spare keys to each other's homes, so someone could keep an eye on the house when a family went on vacation. Using their keys, the neighbors entered Chris and Jeanette's home to see if their suitcases were still there. What they found was alarming. The suitcases remained in the house, as did Chris's wallet and phone. His essential medications, which he couldn't go without for long trips, were still in the fridge. However, Chris's Toyota 4Runner SUV was missing from the garage. The neighbors turned to Ben Demonstranti, who lived across the street with his family. Chris and Jeanette had bought a deep-sea fishing boat, but had nowhere to dock it, so Ben had generously allowed them to use his pier. Because of this arrangement, the two families were close. Chris often shared his fresh catch with Ben, and since he went out to sea every day, the men saw each other regularly. But Ben hadn't seen Chris for several days either, and he hadn't been able to reach the couple by phone. Not knowing what to think, the neighbors contacted Jeanette's sister, Regina, who lived with her family in New Jersey. But Regina had no idea that her sister and brother-in-law had planned any trip. They hadn't called or mentioned anything about leaving town. Growing more worried, the neighbors reported Chris Benedetto, 42, and Jeanette Piro, 45, missing to the police on November 16, 1998, 5 days after they were last seen. The authorities launched an investigation, starting with a search for the missing Toyota 4Runner, believing that if they found the vehicle, they might find Chris and Jeanette. Naturally, upon learning about her sister and brother-in-law's disappearance, Regina couldn't just sit idly by. She and her husband reached out to Chris's brothers to inform them of the situation. Regina's husband, Michael Koblin, promised to fly to Florida himself to find out what had happened to Chris and Jeanette. That same day, Monday, November 16th, Michael arrived on Singer Island from New Jersey. He met with the neighbors and told them the same thing he had told Chris's brothers, that he would do everything he could to uncover the truth. Knowing how much Chris and Jeanette loved being on the water, Michael visited several marinas, asking around. Eventually, he learned that the couple had taken a friend's boat to the Bahamas and that they were expected to return soon. By Monday evening, employees at a local hotel called the police. After seeing the news about the search for a Toyota 4Runner, they noticed a vehicle matching the description parked near the hotel. When officers arrived to check the license plate, they confirmed that it was Chris's SUV. This led the police to believe that the couple might have parked the car there, met up with friends at the hotel, and then left with them on their boat for the Bahamas. By the sixth day of the couple's disappearance, the police saw little cause for concern. However, Chris's two brothers were growing increasingly worried that the couple had not returned. They began to suspect that something might have happened to them along the way. Despite the fact that the route from Singer Island to the Bahamas was one of the easiest crossings, taking only about 3 hours, late November brought unpredictable conditions. Winds and currents could quickly turn a pleasant trip into a deadly trap. Additionally, the brothers couldn't understand when Chris and Jeanette had supposedly left. Was it on the night they missed dinner? Or the following day? None of it made sense. Such impulsive behavior was completely out of character for the couple. They would never leave without telling anyone. And if they had planned to be gone for an extended period, they would have taken at least one suitcase and Chris's essential medication. Determined to get answers, the brothers traveled to Florida to investigate in person. They stayed at Chris and Jeanette's house, and being law enforcement officers in New York, they knew exactly how to conduct a search. They handed out flyers, questioned locals, and went door to door, hoping to gather any useful information. But after a week of searching, they had learned nothing new. With no fresh leads, they had no choice but to return home. Before leaving, they decided to unplug some non-essential electrical appliances to avoid unnecessary power consumption in the empty house. As they walked through the house, looking for appliances to unplug, Chris's brothers entered the garage. There, they noticed a small chest freezer where Chris usually stored his catch and bait. But something was off. It had been pushed under a table, as if someone had deliberately moved it to hide it from view. Curious, they opened the freezer. At first, they couldn't comprehend what they were seeing, but then it hit them. The frozen body of a person was crammed inside. The freezer was small, meaning someone had to go to great lengths to force an adult's body into it. The victim was positioned head first, making identification difficult. But after a closer look, the brothers realized it was Jeanette. Shocked, they immediately called the police. Detectives rushed to the scene. Now they had a body and a crime scene, but also a major problem. Neighbors, Michael Koblin and Chris's brothers, had all been inside the house, searching for clues about Chris and Jeanette's whereabouts. They had touched various objects with their bare hands while trying to determine what the couple had taken with them. This meant that any forensic evidence found at the scene could be compromised. The medical examiner arrived at the scene. Since Jeanette's body was frozen to the inside of the chest freezer, he decided to transport the entire freezer along with the victim. Due to the effects of freezing, the pathologist stated that determining the exact date and time of death would be impossible. However, in a stroke of luck for the investigation, the freezing process had preserved the body in near-perfect condition. Rigor mortis had never had a chance to set in and cause decomposition-related changes. Even though more than 2 weeks had passed since the murder, the pathologist was able to identify clear signs of strangulation. The killer had wrapped a rope around Jeanette's neck twice and strangled her to death. So the wife was found murdered, strangled in their home, while the husband was missing and his car had been abandoned near a hotel. It was no surprise that detectives immediately considered Chris a suspect. Even though friends and neighbors insisted that Chris and Jeanette had a wonderful, trusting relationship and were happy in their marriage, investigators knew better. Experience had taught them that no one truly knows what happens behind closed doors. Could there have been something going on in their lives that even their closest friends and family had no idea about? But how could they find Chris now? If he had killed his wife and fled, he had a 2-week head start to evade the police. In today's world, investigators might try tracking a fugitive's smartphone or mobile data, but in 1998, the police could only rely on Chris's bank accounts. However, none of Chris's accounts had been used. He hadn't withdrawn money or used his cards. It was a dead end. That is, until a breakthrough came from Chris and Jeanette's neighbor, Ben Demonstranti. Ben had been thinking a lot about the case because he was a close friend of the couple. Suddenly, to his own surprise, he realized that he was the last person to have heard from Chris. Ben had previously worked as a beach lifeguard, and he knew that even the smallest detail could turn out to be crucial. So he contacted the police and revealed that on November 11th, he had heard Chris leave to go fishing, as he usually did. It was around 8 a.m. Ben hadn't seen Chris, but he had heard his voice as Chris said to someone, "Grab the fishing rods." After that, the boat's engine started and they went out fishing. A couple of hours later, the boat returned, but Chris wasn't on it. The boat was being driven by a man Ben didn't recognize. The man left the boat in its place, walked to Chris's car, started the engine, and drove off. At the time, Ben didn't think much of it, but now, In light of the recent events, he replayed the details in his mind. 2 people had gone out on the boat, but only one had come back. Given what had happened to Jeanette, Ben began to suspect that Chris hadn't returned because he had met the same fate as his wife. The investigators shared Ben's concern and asked him to describe the unfamiliar man. Ben explained that he was a large man with a round face, graying hair, and he appeared to be between 40 and 50 years old. The detectives immediately thought of Chris's brothers, who fit that description. They asked Ben if they could arrange for the suspects to pass by his house. Would he be able to identify the man? Ben assured them he would. At the same time, forensic investigators were examining Chris's boat and SUV. Both were impeccably clean, gleaming with spotless condition. While Chris was known to be a tidy person, this level of cleanliness was surprising, especially since the boat, which he used daily for fishing, didn't even have traces of fish blood. However, the forensic team did find something interesting. First, on the boat, they discovered a rope that was the same size and shape as the one used to strangle Jeanette. Secondly, they noticed that the spare anchor was missing. Sometimes boat owners prefer to have 2 anchors on board for added safety, but the second one is almost never used. This led investigators to question why the spare anchor was gone and whether it could be a clue to the whereabouts of Chris Benedetto. Later that same day, the police organized an impromptu identification with Ben Demonstranti to see if he could recognize the stranger he had seen on November 11th. Ben stood in front of the house when a car pulled up, and out stepped the police officers, Chris's brothers, and Michael Koblin. Ben immediately recognized the man. The man apparently recognized him too. Their eyes locked, and Ben felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling in the stranger's gaze, something that promised nothing good. Ben turned to the detectives and said, "I've seen this man before." It was Michael Koblin. The police invited Michael to the station and asked him if he had been on Chris's boat on November 11th. He denied it, stating that he was not even in the state, he had been in New Jersey. His wife, Regina, Jeanette's sister, confirmed his alibi. All the family members, including Chris's brothers, were also shocked that the police had suspected Michael. Chris and Michael were not just relatives, but close friends and business partners. The 2 men owned a transportation company together. Chris had invested nearly all his money into the company and owned 49%, while Michael held the remaining 51%. As far as the family knew, Chris and Michael had a good relationship, and there had never been any conflict between them. The police had no choice but to release Michael, and he returned to New Jersey. Ben Demonstranti couldn't believe it. He had seen Michael with his own eyes. Could he have made a mistake? He was restless, tormented by the thought that he had wrongly accused an innocent person. But the police weren't ready to completely rule out Michael as a suspect. They decided to dig a little deeper and see where it led. The police looked into Chris Benedetto's financial situation and discovered that he had lent Michael a substantial sum of money, $160,000. If Chris had demanded the money back from Michael, and Michael had no way to pay it back and had run out of excuses, it was possible that he might have decided to kill Chris and Jeanette. However, proving this would be incredibly difficult, especially in the case of Chris's murder, because the police had neither a body nor a crime scene. The investigators thought that if Michael had indeed been in Florida on the day of the murders, he most likely used his credit card to purchase a plane ticket. They discovered that Michael had an American Express account, and there was another person who could use his card, someone named Mike Carey. Interestingly, Mike Carey had bought a flight to Florida on November 10th and returned to New Jersey on the 12th. The investigators had to find out who this Mike Carey was. Perhaps Mike Carey resembled Michael Koblin, and Ben had simply made a mistake. However, there were 16 men named Mike Carey in the country who were of the right age. The police checked each of them, eliminating them one by one. It took months, but none of them matched the description. None knew Michael Koblin, none had been to Florida, and none owned an American Express card. While the police were still investigating the identity of Mike Carey, Chris's family filed a lawsuit against Michael Koblin's family because he had not returned the $160,000 that belonged to Chris and Jeanette. In response, Michael declared bankruptcy, which seemed to confirm that he was unable to repay the debt. Though the lawsuit would eventually be dismissed in August 2002, Chris's family likely began to believe that the police's suspicions were not unfounded. In March 1999, another shocking and inexplicable event occurred. Michael Koblin was attacked near an office complex in West Orange, New Jersey. Unknown assailants struck him in the head, leaving a skull fracture, and tore off his pants and underwear. However, the attackers did not steal his wallet or any other valuables. After the beating, Michael was in critical condition and unable to speak. The police never managed to determine who had attacked Michael or whether it was connected to the murders. It's possible that someone in the family felt the investigation was progressing too slowly, or perhaps Michael had angered someone else, or it was just a random attack. In June 1999, the police began examining the phone records of Michael Koblin and his wife Regina. It turned out that on November 11, 1998, at 2:14 p.m., someone had made a call from Florida to Regina's mobile phone. The call was made from a payphone at a hotel within walking distance of the couple's home. Detectives visited the hotel, where they found a registration card under the name of Mike Carey. Here's where it got interesting. The registration card listed the home address of Michael Koblin. A handwriting expert from the FBI confirmed that the card had been filled out by Koblin himself. This meant that Michael Carey was simply a made-up name by Michael Koblin. The police had now disproved his alibi. He had in fact been in Florida on November 11th, and both he and his wife had lied. The detectives knew that when Michael came to search for Janet and Chris a week after their disappearance, he stayed on a friend's boat. Investigators examined all incoming and outgoing calls from the boat and noticed that Michael had called a jewelry store in New York. Initially, the police didn't pay much attention to this, but then they realized that Janet's engagement ring, diamond earrings, and watch were missing. They were certain of this because in July 1998, Janet had filmed every room of her house for insurance purposes. Specifically, she filmed her jewelry. Also in Chris's safe, there was a certificate from the jewelry store. The missing jewelry was worth $58,300. The police concluded that Michael had stolen the jewelry and taken it to the jeweler to return it and get money or sell it. In May 2003, more than 4 years had passed since the investigation began. The detectives flew to New York to speak with the jeweler. He confirmed that Michael had visited the store. Michael told the jeweler that the owner of the jewelry was dead and her husband was missing. Since Michael had spent a lot of money, he took the valuables from the safe. The jeweler agreed to take the jewelry, but paid a sum lower than their real value, suspecting that something was not right. The police were certain that if they could link Michael to the missing jewelry of the murdered woman, they could arrest him. The prosecutor promised the jeweler immunity during the trial if he could get Michael to make a compromising statement. The jeweler agreed. He said Michael was supposed to come in 2 weeks to pick up a piece of jewelry for his daughter. On the scheduled day, the jeweler wore a recording device and was given instructions on how to start the conversation with the suspect. When Michael appeared in the store, the jeweler whispered to him that the FBI had visited and asked what he should say about the jewelry. Michael replied that as far as he knew, the jeweler had never seen them again. He added that if the jeweler talked, he would seriously set him up. That was enough for the police. The man was arrested and taken to the station, but, of course, he was not about to confess to anything. However, the detectives already had a good idea of what happened on that day, November 11th. Around 8 a.m., Chris and Michael went aboard Chris's boat. The vessel left the shore. Based on the fact that Michael bought a plane ticket under a fake name, it was clear that he had planned the murder in advance. Chris didn't even need to bring up the issue of the debt. His fate was already sealed. Once the boat was far from shore, Michael decided to act. He attacked Chris, possibly wounding or hitting him in the head, catching him off guard. Then Michael wrapped the anchor chain around Chris's body and threw him overboard. He knew that once the body hit the water, the heavy chain and anchor would drag it under, and the Gulf Stream would carry it out into the Atlantic Ocean. Afterward, Michael returned to Chris's house. He couldn't leave Janet alive because she knew he was in Florida and had seen the two men head out fishing together. Michael strangled Janet with the rope he had taken on the boat, shoved her into the small freezer chest head first, and hid the chest under the table so it wouldn't be noticed. Most likely, the murderer had planned to dispose of the second body a week later, but he couldn't do so because it had frozen to the side of the freezer, and Michael couldn't move it. It's very likely he had planned to throw Janet overboard just like her husband. This was a cold-blooded, premeditated murder. He had thought it all through, but his greed doomed him. Had he not been tempted by Janet's jewelry, the police would never have been able to connect him to the murders, even though they were certain of his guilt. The trial of Michael began on February 16, 2005, 7 years after the murders. His defense claimed that he had indeed visited Florida on the day of the murders, but for an affair. According to them, he had a mistress in Florida. They suggested that the couple had actually been killed by drug dealers. Furthermore, his lawyers argued that Michael had cooperated with the police and even helped pay for the funeral expenses, which they claimed proved his innocence. Interesting logic. Overall, the defense strategy seemed absurd, And it was no surprise that the jury sided with the prosecution. In May 2005, Michael Koblin was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of a heart attack 2 years later in prison. During the trial, it was revealed that the police believed Michael had an accomplice. The name was not disclosed, but it's easy to guess that it was Regina, who lied to provide an alibi for her husband and continued to cover for him afterwards. Unfortunately, she was not held accountable for her involvement in the murders of her own sister and brother-in-law. Michael Koblin almost got away with double murder. He carefully planned his actions, let the Gulf Stream carry Chris's body into the ocean, and left no physical evidence behind. But what he didn't account for was the close-knit community of Singer Island, always ready to support their neighbors and make sure a murderer didn't escape justice. Do you have a good relationship with your neighbors?